I'm Alma Angeles and you're watching Eagle News International.
And I'm CJ Hero. Here are tonight's headlines.
The U.S. Senate is expected to deliver a verdict in Donald Trump's impeachment trial this weekend after his lawyers argue that the former president bears no responsibility for an attack by supporters on Congress after he failed to win re-election.
The head of the EU's disease control agency warns that the novel coronavirus could last indefinitely, even as global infections slow by nearly half and vaccine rollouts gather pace in some regions.
And the situation in Myanmar is deepening, with police firing rubber bullets and arresting protesters.
And a new vast swarm of desert locusts hits
livelihoods,
Kenya.
Pastors were affected. Now between this
Donald Trump's impeachment defense team turned the tables on Democrats, arguing that the former president incited violence by urging supporters to fight like hell, showing a lengthy montage of Democratic politicians to galvanize their own backers, seeking to turn the table on Democrats. They used this video of evidence. Defense lawyers played their own compilations. Let's take a look.
The more the House managers speak, the more hypocrisy gets revealed. Hypocrisy. The gathering on January 6th was supposed to be a peaceful event. Make no mistake about that. And the overwhelming majority of those in attendance remained peaceful. As everyone knows, the president had spoken at hundreds of large rallies across the country over the past 5 years. There had never been any mob-like or riotous behaviors, and in fact, a significant portion of each event was devoted to celebrating the rule of law, protecting our Constitution, and honoring the men and women of law enforcement. Contrast the president's repeated condemnations of violence with the rhetoric from his opponents.
I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters.
The vast majority of the protests have been peaceful.
Republicans stand for law and order, and we stand for justice.
I just don't even know why there aren't uprisings all over the country, and maybe there will be.
My administration will always stand against violence, mayhem, and disorder.
There needs to be unrest in the streets for as long as there's unrest in our lives.
This impeachment is completely divorced from the facts, the evidence, and the interests of the American people. The Senate should promptly and decisively vote to reject it.
They continue to say insurrection. Clearly, there was no insurrection. Insurrection is a term of art defined in the law.
No thinking person could seriously believe that the president's January 6th speech on the ellipse was in any way an incitement to violence or insurrection. The suggestion is patently absurd on its face.
They manipulated video, time-shifting clips, and made it appear the president's words were playing to a crowd when they weren't. Let's take a look.
After this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down to the Capitol. But I think right here, we're going to walk down to the Capitol. And we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women, and we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong. We have come to demand that Congress do the right thing and only count the electors who have been lawfully slated. I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
But please stop the hypocrisy. And did you tone down the rhetoric last summer when all of this was happening? Did you condemn the rioters, or did you stand with Nancy Pelosi, who said, people are going to do what they're going to do?
It asks for constitutional cancel culture to take over in the United States Senate. Are we going to allow canceling and banning and silencing to be sanctioned in this body?
Impeachment managers say Trump, who has never expressed remorse for his encouragement of the violent crowd, is so dangerous that he should be barred from holding office again. It would take a two-thirds majority to convict, meaning 17 Republicans would need to join the Senate's 50 Democrats.
Meanwhile, an official on President Joe Biden's staff was suspended Friday after allegedly threatening to destroy a reporter who was asking about his personal life. White House Deputy Spokesman T.J. Ducklo was suspended for 1 week without pay, Biden's press secretary Jen Psaki said. According to Vanity Fair magazine, Ducklo called up Politico reporter Tara Palmieri after she began asking questions about his months-old personal relationship with a reporter from Politico rival Axios, Alexi McCammond. Politico Playbook, the Washington politics, tips, and gossip newsletter that Palmieri reports for, wrote this week that McCammond made it public in November that she was dating Ducklo. I will destroy you, Ducklo said to Palmieri in a phone call shortly after the January 20 inauguration of Biden as president. According to Vanity Fair, Ducklo made derogatory and misogynistic comments to Palmieri and called her jealous. Listen to this.
T.J. Ducklo, who is the deputy who you're asking about, has apologized to the reporter, quite shortly after the comments were made. He had a heated conversation about a story related to his personal life. I'm not saying that's acceptable, but I just want to be clear that it was not about an issue related to the White House or a White House policy or anything along those lines. He's the first to acknowledge this is not the standard of behavior set out by the president, nor is it the standard of behavior set by me, and I'm his direct supervisor. In addition to his initial apology, he sent the reporter a personal note expressing his profound regret. He has been placed, as you noted, on a 1 week suspension without pay.
The world should be prepared for the coronavirus to continue to circulate long-term despite the rollout of vaccines. That is according to the head of the EU's health agency, ECDC, Andrea Ammon, in an interview conducted via video call by AFP. Let's listen in.
We know that this post-COVID-19 condition, or as some patients also call it long COVID, and some clinicians call it long COVID, is a heterogeneous group of symptoms that occur after the acute illness. So these are symptoms or complications that can happen potentially a month after, 3 months after, or even 6 months after. And as we're learning more, we're trying to understand the real duration of this condition. We are concerned, obviously, with the numbers of patients infected with SARS-CoV-2 virus, that the numbers, even if it's, we don't know how common it is or how uncommon it is, but the numbers, just by the magnitude of the pandemic, will impact health systems. Some reports are showing that some of the more common symptoms of the post-COVID-19 condition can be fatigue, post-exertional malaise, and cognitive dysfunction. And so, and sometimes you may be hearing patients describe that as brain fog. What we know thus far is that patients experiencing post-COVID-19 condition could have been hospitalized patients, those in the ICU. So we do know that that has happened in patients who were very sick, but also in patients who were not managed inside the hospital, those patients that were deemed to have, what we thought was mild illness and were treated in the ambulatory outpatient setting. But in fact, did have complications and did have persistent symptoms or new symptoms, or persistent symptoms or symptoms that waxed and waned, that came and went after their acute illness. What we don't know is why it's happening. So what is the pathophysiology or the etiology of this condition? And so the researchers are really working hard to get to the answers of these questions.
While vaccines dramatically reduce the risk of contracting the illness caused by COVID-19, scientists have not yet established with certainty whether vaccines also reduce transmission of the virus, and there is also particular concern that the vaccines may not be as effective against some of the variants of COVID-19, especially the South African and Brazilian ones.
It's a heterogeneous group of symptoms that occur.
The Interagency Task Force for the Management of Emerging Infectious Diseases, or the IATF-EID, has allowed more businesses nationwide here in the Philippines to resume operations amid the COVID-19 pandemic, according to Malacanang. In a press statement, presidential spokesperson Harry Roque said the IATF-EID has approved the reopening of driving schools, traditional cinemas, and video and interactive game arcades in the country. Let's listen in.
Inaprubuhan po ng inyong IATF ang pag-relax o pagluwag ng restriction sa mga reliyosong pagtitipon o religious gathering sa mga lugar na nasa ilalim ng General Community Quarantine simula Lunes, 15 ng Pebrero. Pinapayagan na sa mga lugar na nasa GCQ ang religious service na hanggang 50% ng seating or venue capacity. Ang umiiral sa ngayon po ay 30% capacity lamang. Inapruban din po ng inyong IATF sa kanilang huling pagpupulong ang muling pagbubukas o pagpapalawak ng mga sumusunod na negosyo o industriya. Unang-una, driving schools, mga sinihan or traditional cinemas, video and interactive game arcades, libraries, archives, museums at cultural centers, meetings, incentives, conferences and exhibitions, at limitadong social events at accredited establishments ng Department of Tourism. Inaprubahan din ang muling pagbubukas ng limited tourist attractions tulad ng mga parks, theme parks, natural sites at historical landmarks. Ang muling pagbubukas na ito ay subject sa implementing guidelines na mag-i-issue na magsasabi ng operational capacity at oversight ng appropriate regulatory agency at mga lokal na pamahalaan kung nasaan ang mga negosyo at ang mga industriya. Ang mga nasabing negosyo at industriya ay kailangan pa rin mahigpit na sumunod sa minimum health standards ng Department of Health. Dahil nakikita natin na hindi naman po tumataas ang ating attack rate, no? At hindi naman po masikip o yung ating mga hospital sa ating pagkapuntan. No? In other words, wala po tayong problema pagdating dun sa ating utilization rate. At syempre po, alinsunod dito sa katotohanan na kinakailangan natin magbukas pa ng ekonomiya dahil kinakailangan magkaroon ng karagdagang hanap buhay yung ating mga kababayan. Yung mga nabuksan po nating industriya, marami pong mga nagtatrabaho dyan na matagal nang walang hanap buhay. Ngayon po, makakapaghanap buhay na sila.
The IATF-EID's latest decision came after President Rodrigo Duterte expressed concern over the current state of the Philippine economy. The country's economic team is calling for the further relaxation of quarantine rules in the country to revive the economy.
In other news, acute malnutrition now threatens half of children under 5 in Yemen in 2021, and 400,000 could die if they don't receive treatment urgently, according to UN humanitarians in a warning. Take a look.
It shows that after years of conflict, the Yemeni people can't take it anymore. They can't feed their families, and they don't have the means to survive without massive assistance going into the country every month. The World Food Programme supports 13 million people every month. The war has to stop, and in the meantime, we have to continue to support the Yemenis so that they can feed their families, the children can survive, and we have these figures reduced.
According to 4 UN agencies, nearly 2.3 million youngsters are likely to suffer acute malnutrition this year throughout the country, which has been at war for 6 years. In their latest report on the crisis, the humanitarians warned that malnutrition damages a child's physical and mental development, especially during the first 2 years of life. It's largely irreversible, perpetuating illness, poverty, and inequality, added the Food and Agriculture Organization, UN Children's Fund, the World Food Program, and the World Health Organization. Preventing malnutrition and addressing its devastating impact starts with good maternal health, yet around 1.2 million pregnant or breastfeeding women in Yemen are projected to be acutely malnourished in 2021, according to the latest UN data.
A constellation of sometimes debilitating symptoms among people who have recovered from COVID-19 is set to impact on global health systems. That's the message from the World Health Organization on Friday, which said that post-COVID-19 condition can occur after the acute illness had passed. Symptoms include neurological and physical problems, and these have prevented sufferers from returning to work, occurring up to 6 months after the initial recovery period, according to Dr. Janet Diaz, head of healthcare readiness at the UN agency. Let's listen to that.
We know that this post-COVID-19 condition, or as some patients also call it long COVID, and some clinicians call it long COVID, is a heterogeneous group of symptoms that occur after the acute illness. So these are symptoms or complications that can happen potentially a month after, 3 months after, or even 6 months after. And as we're learning more, we're trying to understand the real duration of this condition. We are concerned, obviously, with the numbers of patients infected with SARS-CoV-2 virus, that the numbers, even if it's, we don't know how common it is or how uncommon it is, but the numbers, just by the magnitude of the pandemic, will impact health systems. Some reports are showing that some of the more common symptoms of the post-COVID-19 condition can be fatigue, post-exertional malaise, and cognitive dysfunction. And so, and sometimes you may be hearing patients describe that as brain fog. What we know thus far is that patients experiencing post-COVID-19 condition could have been hospitalized patients, those in the ICU. So we do know that that has happened in patients who were very sick, but also in patients who were not managed inside the hospital, those patients that were deemed to have, what we thought was mild illness and were treated in the ambulatory outpatient setting, but in fact did have complications and did have persistent symptoms or new symptoms, or persistent symptoms, or symptoms that waxed and waned, that came and went after their acute illness. What we don't know is why it's happening. So what is the pathophysiology or the etiology of this condition? And so the researchers are really working hard to get to the answers of these questions.
Dr. Diaz added that the condition had also been reported among people who had not been hospitalized for acute infection after the acute illness had passed.
Meanwhile, Australia's second-largest city of Melbourne went from welcoming thousands of fans for its Grand Slam tennis tournament to deserted city streets overnight as millions began a 5-day coronavirus lockdown. The lockdown was triggered by a string of cases infected with the UK variant of COVID-19. Let's take a look back.
Is that if we wait for this theory that it might be out there might be more cases than we know about, if we wait for that to be proven correct, it will be too late. And then we will face the prospect of being locked down until a vaccination. There will only be 4 reasons to leave your home: shopping for necessary goods and services, when you need those things, and only what you need.
I feel that's actually a bit of a bad thing, because now the tennis lost a little bit of its spark, and it's all its romance. It's not the romance of the players actually playing. Is there an answer to you're hearing the crowd cheering, the roar?
They were all saying how much they enjoyed having, you know, some sort of audience there, and not having that will be different for them. But they'll play, you know, well anyway. We'll be watching them on TV, but we're sorry we can't go. I don't think they've handled that well. Could have been done differently and in a much better way.
I think almost more time locked in our houses last year than outside. It's just getting a little bit, it's a lot, really. But, you know, whatever we need to do.
The state recorded one new case of COVID-19 today, bringing the total cases in an outbreak of the UK strain to 14. The virus initially leaked from an airport hotel housing international travelers undergoing mandatory quarantine. The city was quiet on Saturday morning with a small number of joggers seen darting through the city center as the capital of the state of Victoria entered its third lockdown since the pandemic began. Under the new measures, which came into place at midnight on Friday, residents have to stay home except for a limited number of permitted essential activities.
Meanwhile, Canada's COVID-19 vaccines rollout will be back on track in March with stepped-up deliveries of doses to make up for recent delays, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Friday. Outstanding deliveries of Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines plus the purchase of additional doses from Moderna, the only two approved for use in Canada so far, will bring the nation's total supply to 84 million doses by the end of September. Here's the Prime Minister.
We've received an updated delivery schedule from Pfizer that brings us to the end of March, and we can confirm we will be receiving the 4 million doses we've been committed to since last November from Pfizer by the end of that month. We will share this schedule with provinces and territories so they can prepare to get all those doses into people's arms. For the months following from Pfizer, we'll be getting the next doses sooner. We've brought forward millions of doses into Q2, so that we will receive 10.8 million doses of Pfizer between April and June, and all of our remaining doses of Pfizer in Q3 before the end of September. That is, we will have received 40 million doses from Pfizer by the end of September. That's part of the reason why we can say with such confidence that everyone who wants a vaccine in Canada will get one by the end of September. We've been continuing to work every single day on getting as many doses as possible, as quickly as possible, into Canadians' arms.
His minority Liberal government faced growing criticism in recent weeks after its immunization effort hit a bump with no domestic production capabilities and deliveries of the first authorized Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna doses sourced from Europe delayed while the number of COVID-19 cases spiked. So far, only 2.4% of Canadians have received the first of two required doses of the two vaccines, and 0.5% have received both shots needed for immunity against the coronavirus.
And the situation in Myanmar is getting worse. In Mon State capital, Malaumian, police moved quickly to clear a sit-in protest by university students. Take a look. Some of the demonstrators were briefly hospitalized after officers opened fire with rubber bullets. But 9 others taken into custody were later freed after a crowd mobbed a police station and demanded their release. The UN opened an emergency human rights council with a warning that any international response to the coup should avoid harming vulnerable people after the Biden administration unveiled targeted sanctions against senior regime figures, with teachers, bureaucrats, and air traffic controllers among the government employees walking off the job this week to demand an end to junta rule. The new military leader, Ming Aung told striking workers to return to their offices. Ahead of another day of mass rallies, state media announced the release of more than 23,000 inmates as part of a prison amnesty. Friday was a public holiday in Myanmar, and mass pardons to empty the country's overcrowded prison system are common on significant local dates. More than 260 people have been detained in the days since the coup and about 20 released, according to the Assistance Association for Political Prisoners Monitoring Group. There was no indication that Suu Kyi or any of her allies were among those set to be freed, and authorities have stepped up a crackdown on striking workers.
Opposition to Myanmar's new military regime intensified today as spontaneous neighborhood watch groups mobilized to thwart arrests of anti-coup activists, and the UN demanded the release of ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi. The army takeover that brought a decade-old democracy to an end last week has unleashed a storm of anger and defiance, with huge daily protests bringing urban centers around the country to a standstill. Crowds defied overnight curfews to mass on the streets as night fell, hours after finishing a 7th straight day of rallies, following rumors that police were launching a fresh wave of arrests. People in Yangon skirted a junta ban on Facebook to organize neighborhood watch groups that warned of rumored arrests. More than 320 people have been arrested since last week's coup, according to the Assistance Association for Political Prisoners Monitoring Group. An emergency session of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva called for the new regime to release all arbitrarily detained persons and hand power back to Suu Kyi's administration. Let's listen in.
May I take it that the draft resolution A/HRC/S29/L1 entitled Human Rights Implications of the Crisis in Myanmar as orally revised may be adopted without a vote? It is so decided.
With this resolution, we would like to send a strong signal to the people of Myanmar. The protection of their human rights matter to us.
We stand with the people of Myanmar who are exercising their democratic and human rights as we uphold our clear duty to promote universal respect for the protection of all human rights. Their wishes must be respected and the coup must be reversed.
Cooperation. Country-specific resolutions like this are not acceptable. We therefore dissociate with this resolution before us.
Meanwhile, the Philippine government distanced itself from the United Nations Human Rights Council resolution that called for the lifting of the state of emergency and the immediate release of all those arbitrarily detained in the military coup d'etat in Myanmar earlier this month. The Philippines joined China, Russia, Venezuela, and Bolivia in dissociating itself from the HRC consensus that adopted the resolution, but without taking a vote, according to Foreign Affairs Secretary Teodoro Locsin Jr. today. The Philippine statement delivered by recorded message for the February 12 HRC special session on Myanmar underscored the importance of recognizing the domestic efforts of a country towards democratic reforms. According to the Department of Foreign Affairs, or the DFA, dissociation does not necessarily mean a vote against the consensus, just that the thinking is not exactly the same as those who joined the consensus. The Philippine government, meanwhile, reiterated its previous call for the complete restoration of the status quo ante as it backs Myanmar's pursuit of democracy. It emphasized that Manila has been supportive of the Southeast Asian nation's progress towards a fuller democracy and acknowledged the military's role in preserving Myanmar's territorial integrity, as well as the unifying role of its de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi in the history of the country.
DFA Undersecretary Sara Lu Ariola and Ernie Abella recently hosted a virtual town hall for Hawaii, where topics ranged from the current status of Filipino during the pandemic to their increasing presence in various professions and industries. We have Alfred Acenas from our Hawaii Bureau with that report.
Sabi nga nila, kayang-kaya ng Filipino yan. Yes, we are hurt, we are hit, but we will survive.
During the Hawaii OFW Town Hall hosted by the Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs, Honolulu Consul General Joselito Jimeno provided an update on the status of Filipinos in the Aloha State.
We number about 370,000 Filipinos, 26% of the 1.4 million population of Hawaii. And Filipinos are the second largest ethnic community, and they represent the biggest non-white ethnic group. In terms of COVID cases, Hawaii surpassed 26,000, which is 1.6% have died. Again, Filipinos ranked second highest, both in terms of infections, 19%, and deaths. Because of the pandemic, the consulate has pivoted its engagement with the community, and our frontline services are shifted to online forums. Let me just tell you about the engagement we have with the Filipino community, which are on two strategic priorities: empowerment and image building. Our engagement is both generational and sectoral. We endeavor to reach first generation, to the young professionals and the youth. We collaborate on many activities with Filipino and Filipino-American businesses, cultural, educational, and social-civic organizations in Hawaii. The consulate does not encounter many ATN cases because, as I said, most of them are permanent residents and immigrants. But we continue to look at the situation of the J1 visa holders. These are the student participants in the exchange visitor program, whose programs are prematurely terminated. Our ATN section provided them with necessary information for their travel to the Philippines. We also regularly monitor the condition of around 300 Filipino fishermen in Hawaii, and we conduct goodwill visits to check on their welfare. The Filipinos' survival instinct, will always be here.
Other guest speakers in the virtual gathering included State Senator Benet Misalucha, who stressed on the importance of more Filipino representation in government, University of Hawaii Program Director Dr. Agnes Malate on the significant roles and contributions of Filipinos in Hawaii's history, Cheryl Yoshimura, who represents the large population of Filipino healthcare workers in the state, and Gemma Weinstein on behalf of Filipino employees in Hawaii's multi-billion-dollar travel and tourism industries. Reporting from Honolulu, Hawaii, I'm Alfred Asenas, Eagle News. We live in interesting times. Back to you.
Eagle News will be right back. Stay tuned.
Happy Babes, manood po kayo ng Happy Time every 12 noon, Mondays to Fridays, dito lang sa Net 25. Happy Time, Happy Time.
Welcome back. There have been calls for President Duterte to renegotiate the Philippines Visiting Forces Agreement with the U.S. President Duterte, however, said the U.S. has to pay first before he reconsiders his decision to scrap the VFA. Take a look.
I would like to put on notice, if there's an American agent here, that from now on, you want the Visiting Forces Agreement done? Well, you have to pay. It's a shared responsibility. But your share of responsibility does not come free.
His statement came amid the uncertain status of VFA, a 1998 military pact between Manila and Washington that authorizes American troops participating in joint military drills to visit the Philippines without passport and visa. The Philippines formally notified the U.S. about its intent to revoke the VFA in February last year. However, the VFA remains in effect after President Duterte ordered on June 1 last year the suspension of VFA termination in light of political and other developments in the region.
In other news, the United States sharply criticizes China for banning BBC World News following a report on the treatment of the Uyghur community, urging Beijing to allow free access to media. Listen to this.
We absolutely condemn the PRC's decision to ban BBC World News. The PRC maintains one of the most controlled, most oppressive, least free information spaces in the world. It's troubling that as the PRC restricts outlets and platforms from operating freely in China, Beijing's leaders use free and open media environments overseas to promote misinformation. We call on the PRC and other nations with authoritarian controls over their population to allow their full access to the internet and media.
Broadcasting regulator on Thursday banned BBC World News, accusing it of flouting guidelines after a controversial report on its treatment of the country's Uyghur minority. The BBC has also aired a hard-hitting documentary accusing China of covering up the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic around the city of Wuhan in late 2019. It aired its report detailing harrowing accounts of torture and sexual violence against Uyghur women in Chinese camps on February 3. The decision also came just days after Britain's own regulator revoked the license of Chinese broadcaster CGTN for breaking UK law on state-backed ownership and provoked angry accusations of censorship from London. Britain has also banned Chinese telecoms group Huawei from involvement in its 5G network after the United States raised spying fears.
In other news, at least 3 people were killed and 8 others wounded after a car bomb detonated near a security checkpoint along a key road in Mogadishu on Saturday. A witness said he heard gunfire and saw vehicles and 3-wheel tuk-tuks scatter before the heavy blast occurred. Let's listen in.
agagaarka hore ee madaxtooyada Villa Soomaaliya gaar ahaan laga galo dhinaca siidka marka anagoo siidka iska taagan waxaan na soo galay gaari oo waxyaabaha qarxa ka buuxo dhinaca Makka al-Mukarrama ayuu ka yimid ciidanka dawladda Soomaaliya ayaa fashiliyay xabaday ku rideen ka damba gaarigii mooto bajaaj wadada maraysa ayuu ku dhuftay ka dambana checkpointiga iyo la soo hadlaysaday waxaan arkay khasaaro hanti baabaaday mooto bajaajyaal badan gubteen baawuro gubteen ka dambana waxaan arkay hal nin oo dhaawac ahay ka dambana meesha ku naf waayay wax meedada indhaha waxay wax meedada qabtay hal nin kaliya alxamdulillah khasaaraha saas ma u badnaad alxamdulillah.
Mogadishu is regularly targeted with attacks by the Al-Qaeda-linked Al-Shabaab group, who have been waging a long and violent insurgency seeking to unseat the internationally backed government in Mogadishu. They were driven out of Mogadishu in 2011, but still control swathes of territory from where they plan and launch frequent deadly strikes against the government and civilian targets.
In other news, a newly formed Himalayan lake raised fears Friday on another flash flood above a disaster-hit valley in northern India, prompting authorities to conduct helicopter surveys and send a team on a 16-hour climb to investigate. Watch this.
बात मैं अभी कहना चाहता हूं और जो बहुत सीरियस बात है वो ये है कि जो ये फ्लड आया था उस फ्लड ने यहाँ पे एक टेम्परेरी डैमिंग की थी और उस टेम्परेरी डैमिंग की वजह से जो ये ऋषिगंगा है जो मेन स्ट्रीम है वो ऋषिगंगा अभी मुझे दिख रही है कि वो ऋषिगंगा अभी पूरी तरह से ब्लॉक है लेकिन ये कह सकता हूँ कि ये पूरी तरह से अभी ये जो ऋषिगंगा जो है वो पूरी तरह से अभी ब्लॉक हुई है और इन फ्यूचर मुझे नहीं पता कि कब तक लेकिन इसमें ये ब्रीच भी होगी ये दोबारा से टूटेगा और इसमें से फ्लड आ सकता है तो इसको जो नदी फट गई है पूरा कोई ताल फटा है ऊपर से
जो भयंकर तरीके से इस समय स्थिति बहुत खराब हो रही है.
Still missing, according to state disaster officials, after a barrage of water and debris hurtled down the valley in the northern state of Uttarakhand with terrifying speed and force on Sunday, obliterating roads and bridges and smashing through dams. The flash flood on the Rishiganga River is thought to have been triggered by a chunk of glacier breaking off or a glacial lake formed when a glacier retreats, bursting its banks. Glaciers are receding fast in the region due to global warming.
To central Kenya now, where teams from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations use small planes to spray a vast swarm of desert locusts with pesticide. Let's take a look.
Now, when we look at the magnitude of the problem, it's much bigger than an outbreak, and it's an upsurge. And so that's really the second biggest intermediate level of infestation that is spreading across the entire region, from Sudan to Somalia to Kenya. So there are 8-9 countries in the region, and then in Yemen, where we have massive infestation of desert locusts since now 18 months, frankly speaking. That in 2020, around 2.5 million people across different livelihoods, farmers, agro-pastorists and pastorists were affected. Now, between December and what we forecast and anticipate until the long rain start April, May, we are talking about 3.5 million people in the region that will be impacted. The bulk of this is in Ethiopia and then in Somalia. In Kenya, it's a little bit less.
As Kenya's heading into the rainy season, we've got immature swarms now. You know, if any of those little swarms do escape us and get into potential breeding areas, you know, that's reinfestation. So every swarm is important at the moment, and if we can, you know, and every swarm is affecting somebody's livelihoods along the way if they're getting into crops. You know, so it's important that we deal with every single one. But I suppose one of the biggest things is we don't want a reinfestation. So if we
The United Nations said that about 3.5 million people in the wider region could be impacted by the new wave of locusts by May. The insects, which can eat their body weight in food in a single day, strip the leaves but not seeds. East Africa has endured a string of disasters of near biblical proportions in 2020, surging rain and devastating floods, locusts, and then amid it all, a viral pandemic.
Heavy snow hits Moscow on Friday morning, with experts expecting record snowfalls over the weekend in the Russian capital. Top expert of the Phobos Weather Center, Yevgeny Tezhakovet, said that the snowstorm would strike Moscow with very high intensity from the early hours of Friday and last for the next 36 hours. He added that winds would reach speeds of 15 to 20 meters per second, while temperatures would drop to as low as 15 degrees Celsius or about 5 degrees Fahrenheit. A spokeswoman for Russian Meteorological Service, Roshidromet Marina Makarova, told AFP that the storm is a continuation of the so-called beast from the east that has swept across Europe over the past week. She said that the agency predicts snowfall in the Russian capital from Friday through to Sunday, totaling up to around 40 centimeters or 16 inches. With some 35 centimeters of snow already blanketing Moscow, she said the depth of snow in the Russian capital could approach or even surpass the record high of 77 centimeters set in March 2013. Makarova added that the expected intensity of the storm was a result of a cyclone sweeping down from the north, first picking up cold air that then mixed with hot air over the Black Sea before turning back up towards central Russia. Scientists say that as the surface layer of oceans warm due to climate change, cyclones are becoming more powerful and carry more precipitation.
And with regular snowfalls in recent weeks, rooftop birds in Sweden's capital have ceded their perches to an army of sweepers clearing the roofs of snow in the name of safety. Let's take a look.
In the beginning it was like scary, all the work and not just the snow. And working on the roof was scary, but after a while you get used to it. It's like usual work. Don't think so much about that, just work. You just, every time you have to think about safety. It's #1 rule, and you don't have room for a mistake here. If you make one mistake, it can be your last mistake. The liberty you have being here on the roof and look at the skies, and you feel that liberty. You are not outside and do your thing.
Yeah, my job is to make sure that no one passes and to blow the whistle to them, so if someone passes, so they don't get ice or snow on them. So it's just I'm just here so people don't get hurt.
If there would be an accident, of course, I'm responsible. If some person would be hurt by the snow or ice falling down on the street, yes.
Case in 2002, a 14-year-old died after being struck by a large block of ice that broke off a building on Stockholm's main shopping street. The constant clearing of snow from the city's roofs is first and foremost done for the safety of the people, but also to maintain the buildings, many of which are hundreds of years old. Under Swedish law, property owners are responsible for clearing snow and ice off their buildings if it threatens to fall and injure someone, but accidents are rare.
We have more updates for you. Please don't go away.
Kumanta, sumaya tayong lahat. Saya-saya.
Welcome back to the news. The Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas Policy Making Monetary Board, or MV, kept the central bank's key rates steady Thursday as expected, given the elevated inflation rate. Today, the BSP's overnight reverse repurchase, or RRP, facility is at a record low 2%, the overnight lending rate at 2.5%, and the overnight deposit rate at 1.5%. Let's listen to that.
The Monetary Board noted that inflation is likely to remain elevated in the coming months, reflecting the impact of supply constraints on domestic prices of key food commodities such as meat and vegetables, as well as the recent uptick in international oil prices. At the same time, the latest baseline projections show inflation returning to within the target range of 2 to 4% over the policy horizon as supply-side influences subside. The Monetary Board also noted that inflation expectations continue to be anchored within the inflation target band. The balance of risk to the inflation outlook now appears to be broadly balanced around the baseline path in 2021, but is seen to continue leaning toward the downside in 2022. Tighter supply of meat products, owing in part to the African swine fever outbreak in the country, could lend further upside pressures on inflation. However, the ongoing pandemic may continue to pose downside risk to demand into the inflation outlook, while recent indicators of activity and sentiment have shown some improvement. The emergence of new variants of the virus and possible delays in mass vaccination programs
continue to temper prospects for economic recovery and growth. On balance,
in other news, former European Central Bank Chief Mario Draghi will be sworn in today as Italy's new prime minister, charged with guiding his country through the devastation wrought by the coronavirus pandemic. Take a look. The 73-year-old, known as Super Mario for doing whatever it takes to save the Eurozone, has put together a national unity government involving almost all of Italy's political parties. Draghi was parachuted in by President Sergio Mattarella after the previous center-left coalition under Premier Giuseppe Conte collapsed. Draghi has spent the last 10 days assembling a broad-based coalition and on Friday night formally accepted the post of prime minister in a meeting with Mattarella. After receiving the support of the largest group in parliament, the Five Star Movement, Mr. Draghi now has backing across the broad political spectrum, and that means he will have a large enough majority to push through his agenda. The country's economy shrank by a staggering 8.9% last year, while COVID-19 remains rife, and restrictions, including a night curfew and the closure of bars and restaurants in the evening, remain in place.
Rudy Gobert and Joe Ingles scored 27 points each as the league-leading Utah Jazz used an explosive and balanced attack to beat the Milwaukee Bucks 129-115 and continue their dominant run through the NBA on Friday. The Jazz had 4 players score 25 points in a game for the first time in franchise history, as Donovan Mitchell, 26, and Jordan Clarkson with 25 also got into an offensive flow in front of a pandemic-limited crowd of almost 4,000 at the Vivint Smart Home Arena. It was the 6th straight win and the 17th victory in 18 games for the Jazz, who became the first NBA team to reach the 20th win mark when they beat Boston on Tuesday. Gobert had 12 assists and 4 blocks, while Clarkson came off the bench to score 25 for Utah, who have beaten Milwaukee twice this season, and both times by double digits. Antetokounmpo finished with 29 points, 15 rebounds, and 6 assists, but the Bucks lost their second game in a row. The Jazz seized control in the second quarter when they outscored the Bucks 34-21. They put up 35 points in the first quarter and nailed 12 of 24 threes in the first half.
In other news, visitors arriving at UAE airports received a Martian ink stamp on their passports in commemoration of the Hope probe's historic arrival to Mars. Take a look.
Finally, in our news, China's space agency released a video footage from its spacecraft circling Mars on Friday, 2 days after it successfully entered the planet's orbit in Beijing's latest ambitious space mission. In the video published by state broadcaster CGTV, the surface of the planet is seen coming into view out of a pitch-black sky against the outside of the Tianwen-1, which entered the orbit of the red planet on Wednesday. White craters are visible visible on the planet's surface, which fades from black or white to black through the video as the probe flies over the course of one Martian day, said official news agency Xinhua. The 5-ton Tianwen-1, which translates as Questions to Heaven, includes a Mars orbiter, a lander, and a solar-powered rover, and launched from southern China last July. It is the latest step in Beijing's space program, which aims to establish a crewed space station by 2022 and eventually put an astronaut on the moon, and has opened up a new extraterrestrial arena for U.S.-China competition. A mission to Mars has to be programmed at exactly the right time during the period of what is known as opposition. That is, when Earth is directly between Mars and the Sun, thereby forming a line. This is called the launch window. Earth and Mars have their own specific rhythm and their own orbits. This means the Martian window occurs every 26 months and lasts a little over 3 weeks. Mars-Earth-Sun alignment has several advantages. It makes it possible for the launcher to adopt a relatively short trajectory. It takes several months to get to Mars, 7 in the case of the U.S. mission Mars 2020. As things stand in scientific research, space agencies must take into account a second constraint: technology. To undertake a voyage of this scale, the rocket must carry a large amount of fuel, which represents a considerable mass. This means the mission launcher must reach specific power levels if it is to reach the red planet.
Nice.
Brilliant minds behind those projects.
That's right.
That's it for tonight's broadcast. Thank you so much for joining us. I am CJ Hero. Please join us again on Monday.
At the end of the day, there remains so much more to be grateful for. I'm Alma Angeles, and we live in interesting times.